Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here today to deliver the Alexander Meiklejohn lecture. I stand on the shoulders of Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, NPR legal affairs correspondent Nina Totenberg, and the former dean of Harvard Law, Martha Minow. No pressure, Cristian. You're just a Latino immigrant from Chile. But it is truly a pleasure to be here. And honestly, the topic is the census, is a hot topic. I must warn you that I am not a scientist, a researcher. I am not a demographer or a statistician. I'm just a journalist who happens to know a little bit about the law and who doesn't like to call himself a lawyer, even though he went to law school. And I'm going to tell you about the history of the 2020 census, more specifically, the efforts to include a citizenship question on it. And but before I tell you that story, I think I should tell you what happened on May 30th, 2019. It is not an overstatement to say that that day may have changed the course, not just of administrative law, but maybe even constitutional history. But before it became that, and before it was this momentous thing, it was just a normal workday for me. I was rushing to catch my train. I had an editorial board meeting at the Times. It was a Thursday, and like usual, I was running like a madman. I live in New Jersey. And a robot on Twitter. Did you know Twitter has robots that scour the site or other parts of the web for things of interest? Well, I follow a robot on Twitter that messed me up that morning. And it has everything to do with this history. It's a robot, and I'm going to show you what it looks like on the screen. It's called the Big Cases bot on Twitter. And if the web, well, there it is. It's a bot that basically scours the web for court filings, for decisions in specific cases that the bot is programmed to follow. And it so happened that this bot was also following the citizenship census case that was filed in New York in the federal district court. And on May 30th, 2019, as you can see from the timestamp, it says 5:40 a.m., but it's really 8:40 a.m. That's some kind of a centralized time. It was 8:40 a.m. that this filing gets posted to this bot. And I have an alert on my phone because I'm a nerd whenever these kinds of filings in big cases get posted. And I see that Department of Commerce versus New York, which is the name of the case, has a new filing. And I go, but wait, this is impossible. This case right now is at the Supreme Court. It's not in the federal district court. The federal district court already ruled in this case. We're just waiting on a decision. The court had heard arguments in late April. So I wonder, what is this with this filing? Something is not right. I ignore a lot of these alerts, but this one I didn't. And I opened it on my way to work. And what I read in that filing shocked me. It shocked me so much that I had to gather my thoughts, stop what I was doing, and try to explain to whoever wanted to read me on Twitter what this filing was doing. And this is what I came up with. A major break in the census litigation. Plaintiffs in the case accused the Trump administration of concealing evidence of the real reason for a citizenship question, to wit, a push to create a structural electoral advantage for, quote, Republicans and non-Hispanic whites, end quote. Wow. I literally said, wow. And as you can see from the retweets, it went viral. And the whole morning, and I posted that at what? 8:49 a.m., a few minutes after that posting went live. My phone was blowing up with responses, people asking me questions. What does this mean? What is going to happen to the Supreme Court case? There was confusion among the general public what this would mean for the broader controversy about the census litigation, especially after the Supreme Court had already heard arguments and was ready to issue a binding decision any moment. I got on my train to work and I get an email from my boss saying, Cristian, we have an A1 story on the New York Times website about precisely this. A reporter also was alerted about this filing and had a story ready to go that was going to appear in Friday morning's paper about this break in the census litigation. And lo and behold, it became an A1 story. And my boss told me, Cristian, there's this new story that I need you to catch up on, and I want you to write an editorial that will appear in tomorrow's paper. I'm like, boss, I'm already on it. I actually tweeted about it before the Times published its piece at 9 a.m. The piece went live at 9 a.m. I was tweeting about it at 8:49. It was such a momentous filing that to this date is still having repercussions, believe it or not. Because the citizenship question for the US Census may be gone and may have been struck down, but its impact remains to this day. Now you may be wondering, what exactly did this filing say? I'm not going to read it for you, and I'm not going to, because it's very intricate, and I was shaking when I was tweeting, because again, the census case has a very interesting feature. Not just one case, the one filed in New York, but there was also one in Maryland and one in California, in that it wasn't so much a civil rights case. It wasn't so much a case about racial discrimination. It wasn't a case about creating partisan advantages for one party over the other. Instead, it was a dry administrative law case governed by the Administrative Procedure Act, the cornerstone of how federal agencies are supposed to promulgate rules and regulations that bind the federal government and therefore the rest of us. Sounds boring, right? Because it was. Administrative procedure and law isn't the cup of tea for many lawyers or law students. But in this era of federal rulemaking has become extremely important for environmental protections, for healthcare, for immigration law, in many areas governed by basically government bureaucrats, people that issue rules and regulations that then have a rippling effect throughout the executive branch. This filing was significant because as time went on and people started counting the days for the Supreme Court to rule in the case, they began wondering, will this have an impact on how the justices rule? I'm going to be honest with you. I have seen and attended many Supreme Court arguments in my life. And when I attended this hearing on the census case in April in Washington, I was as demoralized as the next guy. I tend to not to wear my emotions when I write about the law because you can't. The law is harsh. The law has tough consequences on real people. And sometimes you have to be able to keep a straight face as you tell people, hey, look, this decision is going to mean X or Y for you. But in this case, when I entered that courtroom and heard the justices grapple with the supposed reasons for adding a citizenship question, I couldn't believe my ears. The Trump administration all along, since March 2018, and then in congressional testimony before Congress, Secretary Wilbur Ross of the Department of Commerce insisted that this question was necessary to enforce the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the cornerstones of federal civil rights protections in the world. Now, for anyone who has been paying attention to the record on civil rights, for the current administration, they may wonder, well, wait, this administration cares about voting rights? Is this why they need this question? They really want to protect the franchise? And exactly. People laugh because it didn't make sense on its face. It was a risible rationale. And That's what trials are made of. That's why lawsuits get filed, because when you file a lawsuit, you simply have allegations. You have an idea of what might be happening behind the scenes, but you file a lawsuit because you want to get at the truth. You want to get at why a particular legal decision or a policy decision was made, and you want to ask, was this in accordance with the Constitution and laws? And that's why these groups, these were not highfalutin lawyers, although many of them belong to very powerful law firms or civil rights organizations like this American Civil Liberties Union, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and other immigration rights groups that were concerned about the addition of a citizenship question. These groups weren't just filing this lawsuit and other lawsuits to stick it to a president they disagree with, although they had reasons to. They did it for a very practical reason. If this question on citizenship moves forward, their communities will be impacted. Their residents of very, very, very disempowered communities already, many immigrant communities, many communities that are mixed communities of undocumented and citizens. One thing that is often lost in discussions around this particular controversy is that, oh yeah, this is all about undocumented immigrants and how, we want to count them as well, but no. If there's one undocumented parent who happens to have 3 US citizen children, if the parent says, no, I'm fearful of answering this form on citizenship because I'm afraid what they're going to do with my information. I don't want them to crack down on my family. A family of 4 doesn't get counted. Not just one, a family of 4. Now multiply that by the entire community. And you can see why a question that on its face may seem normal. The president has wondered in tweets, but what's wrong with asking about citizenship? That's fine. It's fine to know who is in our borders, who is a citizen and who isn't. The same thing happened with some of these Supreme Court justices. Justice Samuel Alito, dissenting in the Supreme Court decision, said, there is international consensus about asking about citizenship. No one questions the wisdom of asking this question. There's nothing wrong with asking this question. And I tend to agree. There's nothing wrong with it. You should agree too. But what isn't normal is adding this question through political maneuverings for the explicit purpose, partisan advantage, and outright plain racism. When the question came to light, when this filing, these documents came to light, and I'll get into the source of those documents very quickly, there were congressional hearings assembled very quickly, and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, who happens to be a representative of a district that includes parts of the Bronx and Queens, very much immigrant-rich populations, was wondering where did this come from and why didn't Secretary Ross ever tell us or the American public that it was animating this question. What is it with this racism? She used the word racism that now is emanating from the highest corners of the government. How come the courts aren't doing anything about this? The census case was never a civil rights case. As I said moments earlier, it was an administrative law case governed by very complex rules of administrative procedure. But the specter of electoral advantage for Republicans and non-Hispanic whites suddenly turned a dry administrative law case into one about discrimination and civil rights. And whenever the government uses race, creates racial categories for the express purpose of affecting one community and benefiting another, that's explicit discrimination forbidden by the US Constitution. Under the 5th Amendment for the federal government and under the 14th Amendment for the states. So would the Supreme Court do something about this? They already had the case. They already heard arguments. They already got all the briefs and all the papers. And this filing, that same day, through these same lawyers, made its way through the Supreme Court. As an FYI, justices, we want you to know that we found a new trove of documents. We want you to take account of it, just so you know. These lawyers that filed this case were very specific. They put it plainly to the justices: don't make the wrong decision. If you make a wrong decision, if it later comes to light, because we're going to litigate the hell out of this. They didn't use those words, but they said we're going to litigate these new documents, and we're going to examine them through depositions, through more document requests. If it later comes to light that racism was truly the animating force behind the citizenship question, you will live to regret this. They didn't say it with those words, but if you read those letters that were filed with the court after May 30th, you can see it very clearly. They're almost daring the court to make the wrong decision. I am grateful for civil rights organizations that do that. They've been losing a lot in this era. They're not winning many cases. They're winning some, they're losing many of them. But they basically put the court on notice. Now, about these documents, the story is a bit of a yarn, but I'll give you the short version of it. Thomas Hofeller is, or was, a Republican strategist who was known as the Michelangelo of gerrymandering, of map making, and the redrawing of electoral districts. He was the one that in 2015, and all through the Trump transition and the early days of the new administration, he had devised the public rationale for this voting rights enforcement pretext. He was the mastermind behind it. He was the one who wrote those words, Republicans and non-Hispanic whites receiving electoral advantage. The reason you never knew anything about it is that he knew how to cover his tracks. He was a very careful operative. There's a great quote in the emails that came out from his estate. Where he is quoted as saying, emails are the tools of the devil. He didn't believe in leaving a record of where his fingerprints were because he knew that it may later come out in litigation. He knew how to very carefully craft explanations for decisions that wouldn't have a tinge of unlawful racial discrimination. In this email, as a result of this death, his daughter came across a whole bunch of hard drives and thumb drives in her mother's home. The daughter, Stephanie Hofeller, was estranged from him. She was not in speaking terms with him, and one day out of the blue, he felt the need to Google her dad. And she saw an obituary in the Times saying that he had died. Cancer, I believe. And that's when, she went through some weird reckoning of her relationship with her dad and went back home to gather some belongings and maybe get some old photos from his computer. And in rummaging through his personal effects, he discovered this trove of documents that later ended up in the hands of a civil rights organization in North Carolina. That organization then alerted the ones in New York, which then presented this evidence, this late arriving evidence to the district court, basically accusing the Trump administration of lying and concealing material evidence for a case of monumental proportions. And that month, between the end of May 30th to the end of June, when the decision was rendered by the Supreme Court, was shrouded in both mystery and chaos, because filings were coming and going both at the Supreme Court, both at the district court level, at the appeals court level. The courts in California and Maryland also wanted this evidence because it was material to their cases, until finally a judge in Maryland, this judge in particular, couldn't do anything with this. He couldn't reopen the case, procedurally speaking. The case was already at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had jurisdiction over this matter. So he couldn't reopen it and say, okay, let's take new evidence and let's rule again in this case. But the judge in Maryland could do that. The judge in Maryland didn't get his case before the Supreme Court. He was still dealing with some other issues. And he was able to reopen the evidence. He was able to rule that, yes, this evidence is relevant of racial discrimination. This evidence may be probative of illicit intent. So let us go back to the drawing board. And he ordered limited discovery to probe the mental processes of a few administration officials in order to get at the real reason for the citizenship question. The reason I emphasize real reason is that throughout these three high-power lawsuits, that real reason was a mystery. That's what the judge in Maryland called it. He called it, quote, a mystery. We don't know the real reason for the citizenship question. We only know that the public explanation is a sham, is fake. The Supreme Court is partly to blame for that, believe it or not, because in an early stage of the case, it blocked the deposition of Wilbur Ross. The Supreme Court said, nope, you're not going to depose a cabinet secretary. That's too much to ask under a constitutional structure. I don't buy it, but that's what they said. However, I guess it was a compromise decision. They did allow other depositions of other officials. And as a result, this mystery lived on. And now the big question, what will the Supreme Court do in the face of this mounting evidence? When the decision came down at the end of June, I felt a pit in my stomach. Because reading it, and if you've ever read a Supreme Court decision, especially on a high-stakes constitutional / administrative law case, it is very complex, and as a communicator and a journalist, you have to be quick on your feet and read it fast and be able to tell people and tweet it and then write a story on it. Matter of fact, I was on assignment that day to cover both that decision and the partisan gerrymandering decision out of Maryland and North Carolina. Two big assignments on one day. So you have to be fast. And I felt a pit in my stomach because as I read the decision, I read, point 1, the administration wins. Point 2, the Trump administration wins. Yes, the citizenship question doesn't violate the Constitution. Point 3, the administration wins. The citizenship question is not substantively invalid. And I kept reading, point after legal point. They were ruling for the administration in every single point. And then I got to the last point. But we find that on the record that we have here, this question cannot be allowed to stand because the reasons that were offered by Secretary Ross and his associates were not the true ones. There was a significant mismatch, Chief Justice Roberts said, between the public explanation and what was actually happening behind the scenes. Chief Justice Roberts used words like contrived, incongruent. The rationale is a, quote, distraction. He bent over backwards to not use the word lie, deception, falsehoods. He used all these euphemisms for what was a plain lie. But who cares? The question was no more. He killed the citizenship question in that very last section of the opinion. And yet you wonder, why is it that he did what he did? Trump, being Trump, he said, I don't care what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court is wrong. We're still going to move forward. That would have been a disaster. And he said, look, the Supreme Court said, the Trump administration was saying, the Supreme Court said this question is not substantively invalid. We just provided the bad reasons. We just need to provide the real reason. Isn't that interesting? If you don't provide the right public rationale at the beginning, what are you going to provide now that you've been called on a lie? Are you going to provide a non-lie? It's very difficult to reverse engineer something that was malignant from the beginning. In the end, those efforts failed because, unfortunately, there was no time. All along, the Solicitor General of the United States, Noel Francisco, he is the top Supreme Court lawyer for the Department of Justice, gave up the fight for a very simple reason. All along in this litigation, he had told the court, guys, we need a decision pronto because by June 30th, the printer in Illinois needs the answer of whether the question is a go or not. June 30th had come and gone. And after repeated representations to the court that June 30th was the last-ditch deadline, there was no going back. They were hoisted by their own petard. And because of timing issues, the question was no more. Now, why does all of this matter in the broader context of the census? It matters because since the beginning of time, or at least since the beginning of this nation and our Constitution, the census has called for an actual enumeration, those words, actual enumeration of everyone in the country. One thing you learn in law school is that the Constitution, or one maxim of many you learn in law school, is that the Constitution is colorblind, that it doesn't discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity or national origin, that it doesn't mention slaves, that it's not a white supremacist document. And in a way, those arguments have some flair. I understand why they say that. It's true. The Constitution doesn't mention race. It doesn't say the white race is better than the black one or Hispanics or nothing like that. But in the very clause where the census is mentioned and established as a constitutional prerogative, it says the following: representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. The infamous 3/5 clause. 3/5 compromise is in the census clause. That's Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution, if you're interested in looking it up. So from the very beginning, the Constitution may have not mentioned slavery, may have not mentioned black or white, but it made a distinction between free people who could only be white and 3/5 of all other persons. The othering of individuals is baked explicitly into the Constitution. And yet, from that very moment, in 1790, when the first census was carried out, everyone counted. everyone counted in the census. They may not have counted equally, but everyone was to be accounted for purposes of representation in Congress, for purposes of representation in the state legislatures, and for purposes of the allocation of taxes and federal funding. The Census Bureau on its website says the genius of the founders was taking a tool of government and making it a tool of political empowerment for the governed over the government. The Supreme Court in another case said that the census is the linchpin of the federal statistical system, collecting data on individuals, on the characteristics of individuals, households, and housing units throughout the country. There was a key moment in the trial in New York over the citizenship question when Joseph Aboud, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, was called to the stand. He's a statistician. He's a chief statistician for the U.S. Census Bureau. And he was asked, as a person whose specialty is numbers and figures and getting it right, to explain the maneuvering behind the scenes for adding the citizenship question. He had modeled and estimated and written to political appointees, advising them against the question. Because he said, our mission here, the mission of the census is accuracy and fairness and for everybody to be accounted for. We cannot, and every question that gets added to the census, no matter how insignificant or how momentous, it goes through years and years and years of testing. Because the census, in the end, is just a group of technocrats and scientists and demographers and people who just want to carry out a constitutional obligation in a way that's transparent and fair and that truly accounts for every person. And when he was asked by a lawyer if he thought that all this work as an expert that he was doing behind the scenes to get the census right mattered, it almost seemed, according to reports, as though he was choking back tears. And bureaucrats don't get emotional, typically, when asked about their work. And he said, yeah, I thought all along that this work mattered. And yet it was clear, because he was overruled in the end, that all of that expertise didn't matter. All it mattered was to score political points, sow fear in immigrant communities, and getting an untested question on perhaps the purest, most undefiled thing that we have left in the federal government. One of its few crown jewels, the decennial census. And I'm glad that this question, or the legality of it, was fought the way it was, because it allowed, at least for now, for this to remain that way, for the census to remain that way, pure and undefiled by politics. There are still efforts to exclude immigrants from congressional apportionment. In Alabama, officials want to do exactly that. They don't want to count undocumented immigrants when congressional apportionment happens. These litigations will continue happening because that's the reality we face. In the end, let us give thanks to civic society and all these groups that are fighting these battles. And for once, standing up for facts and truth and science in the federal apparatus. It should mean something, right? In a post-truth era, that's one thing that I hope we can all agree on. And I hope that as you think about what I said today, that you can also agree that at a time when it seems like some people are having it harder than others because of their status or who they are or where they come from, and it seems harder for them to live because of things that are coming at them from political actors, that at least in this one little thing called the decennial census, that they can have a little voice into who America is and continues to be. So I hope that we all can agree on that, and that's the message that I want to leave you with today. Thank you.
For that insightful and an inside look into this question. My first question is around, and I want to just pull on the string just a little bit, is the administration can get at this question in so many different ways. The American Community Survey asks the question, there are 10,000 different data sources. Why push it on the official census form?
That's a great question. And even at the Supreme Court, there's this misconception. I personally really disliked when reporters would write, the Trump administration is trying to reinstate the citizenship question in the decennial census. Well, newsflash, there has never in the history of this country been a citizenship question that asks of the entire population, all 300 million plus, this question. Yes, it's been asked in decades past or in smaller surveys or in very discrete test runs, but it's never been a national thing. It's truly an unprecedented thing. And Census Bureau officials and statisticians were telling the administration, let us not ask the question. We can find this data in other ways. We can model it in different ways. Trust our expertise, but do not mess with this decennial thing that we have, that we've worked so hard on. And yeah, the administration can get this information, and it's in fact trying to use this information because the game is always political. And now the line that we're hearing from the government is that this information is needed so that the states can conduct their decade not reapportionment, the redistricting of state legislative districts. And that's the coming fight, I think. What will happen with states that do take up this offer and use this data to, for example, draw districts on the account of people who can vote versus those who can't. And there has been efforts like that to create districts of people, of only voters and all non-voters. Now, mind you, who are non-voters? Not just undocumented immigrants. Who else are non-voters? Children, prisoners, people with perhaps who cannot vote due to a disability. There is many people will be excluded if these efforts are carried to their logical conclusion. So it's truly something that we should be on the lookout. And even though this question is no longer there, the stakes for the long run are truly unprecedented.
Thank you. Just to shift just a tiny bit, what is the work that you're engaged in right now at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia? It sounds it's got such an impressive title.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a fancy title for something that's really a very discrete project. And we hear a lot about how immigrant communities today are being targeted through harsh immigration policies. And but one thing that you don't hear a lot about is how immigrant rights groups are also being targeted, how journalists who are covering immigration are being targeted, how researchers who like to study migration and like to travel with caravan groups or like to go to the Northern Triangle or those countries that are seeing huge migration flows, how they are also being targeted. How? By their phones being searched when they cross the border, by being placed on watch lists for the activities that they engage in. And basically what my project at the Knight Institute entails is to examine all of these anecdotes of real life people, organizations, advocates, journalists whose First Amendment rights are being targeted. And when they are being placed on watch lists like this, we all suffer because we don't benefit from what they have to bring to us. And in a way, our own speech gets suppressed.
Very interesting work. I'm very aware of time, so I want to be sure that the audience has time for a few questions. So is there anyone who would like to break the ice? Yes.
Absolutely. And I think that in a way, the well has already been poisoned. The question may not be anymore on the census. The forms are already printed and they're going to be going out in March, I believe. But the fact that the fear is already there and that there's still this possibility that citizenship data will get released by the Census Bureau through administrative channels, that this will get misrepresented, and will cause immigrant communities and those who are hard to count. Those are really the people who matter, the hard to count ones, that they will be unaccounted for. So yeah, the end goal was always to depress the count, because when you depress the count, places with large immigrant groups, the New Yorks, the Californias, the Texas, the Floridas of the world, they all lose out on federal funding and representation. Don't be shy.
So you end on an optimistic note, right? But it sounds like the fact got lucky, right? But for these hard drives, evidence, the case could have easily gone another way. And so I wonder if you could talk more broadly about the extent to which you think this is happening in other areas of administrative law, executive action, and how truth and facts and evidence might win out, or are they losing in these areas?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, you're totally right that the plaintiffs got lucky. Americans got lucky. The nation got lucky, really, by the discovery of these facts. I don't know if you read the reports, but a few weeks ago, CNN reported that Chief Justice Roberts changed his vote in this case. He was going for the administration, and midway after the hearing, he changed his vote for the plaintiffs, for the challengers, and on that last final point that I told you about. And it was I was shocked, but I wasn't. But I was at the same time kind of relieved that cooler heads prevailed inside the Supreme Court. And again, those smoking guns don't happen often. But one thing that I do appreciate about the intricacies of this case and what they might mean for the future is that administrative law, and Chief Justice Roberts said this in his opinion, depends on policymakers giving the true and genuine reasons for what they do. The Supreme Court was making new law with this part of the opinion. It is truly groundbreaking what this final portion of the opinion does, because if advocates play it wisely, it could truly undermine bad faith efforts to sabotage administrative decisions. And we've seen it, with climate change. We've seen it with the Affordable Care Act, where you see bad faith all over the government, undermining prior policies or overruling prior decisions just because they don't like it. But administrative law demands that policymakers give reasoned answers for why they're making a change. And if there isn't, then the courts have to step in. There's a reason why Clarence Thomas, who was in dissent, he was livid by this ruling. He said, this decision is unprecedented. We're opening the floodgates of the courts to second guess administrative agencies. And we're going now, whenever somebody doesn't like something that an administration does, anyone's going to be able to challenge it in court. And then, government is going to come to a screeching halt. Now, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I don't think things are as dire as he puts it. I think what the ruling does is simply asking our elected officials to be truthful with the public, to be truthful with us. When you tell me that you want to add a citizenship question because you want to enforce voting rights, you guys laughed immediately. And these decisions, at the very least, should pass the laugh test. And whenever something doesn't, that means, yeah, I want judges second guessing that. Sure, let's do it.
How our current federal administration is more the symptom than the disease. You also mentioned that, for example, in Alabama, there's movements happening at the state level. So even if we stop it at the federal level, there's still stuff happening at the state to erode these rights. What should we be aware of? What should we be looking for? at state level to make sure that everybody is counted and counts?
Well, everyone should be very aware of not immigrant rights, but local rights organizations who are making sure that everyone is counted in their communities, hard to count populations, so that everyone truly gets accounted for with the decennial census, and also pay a lot of attention and push your elected representatives to not use whatever citizenship data the administration produces, because they're going to produce they call it, at the census, they call it product. They're going to produce a citizenship product at some point that it's going to be made available to the states. And be wary of what states do with that product, because if it's used for something nefarious at the local level to discriminate against minorities or to exclude them from representation, that's when you have to just basically bug your representatives. I'm glad I have to tip my hat to states like Texas, who have said, we are not going to use citizenship data of any kind to draw legislative districts. And when a red-leaning or conservative state such as Texas takes a stand like that, that sends a message to others. And keep your ear to the ground as to these new moves that are happening at the Census Bureau, I'm sure due to political pressure, to muddy the waters a little bit. Because even though the question is not on the census anymore, a need for this citizenship data, it's been cooked up for who knows what nefarious purpose.
Question.
I guess I was curious as to what demographic changes were already forecast for this next census, like what's going to look different after it, and how has this scare for the citizenship test, or for the citizenship question, how has this scare impacted what's forecast to come?
Yeah, totally. I don't know exactly what the models show for this count coming up, but what is certain is that there is a huge effort afoot by the Census Bureau to get at some of these localities and jurisdictions that are immigrant rich, where people sometimes are never home because they're always working, because they don't bother to check the mail. There are multifamily homes where there's a single mailbox where everyone gets a piece of mail and nobody ever checks the mail. They're not used to things like that. And so there's a lot of things that they're trying to do to make sure that these hard to count groups don't miss out on being included. And what was the second part of the question? That is the fear. That is the fear that the well has already been poisoned, and that's why civil rights groups and civic society organizations and states themselves are pouring tons of resources, tons of money on educational materials, and basically, as census officials will tell you, and that census data is private, is protected by federal law, and I know that there's going to be a lot of scare tactics being employed. But I'm kind of hesitant to say this, but we have to trust the bureaucrats on this one, that they'll protect your data. And when it comes to this is a duty that, from reading on the history of the census and how the officials take this information, this is something that is under lock and key, and that they really guard with everything.
Yes, right here.
That Providence was actually the only place in the country where an end-to-end test of the census for next year was conducted last year in 2018. So there's actually some data about the response rate from that. And the response rate, like in the Hispanic community in general, was much lower than the overall turnout and, of course, the white response rate. So just kind of an interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I saw some figures by Steve Dillinger, the head of the Census Bureau, saying that I think they are expecting around a 60 to 61% initial response rate. Anything over that, or people that don't respond, that's when they send out people to then, actually go in person and try other methods to try to account for everyone. This is the first year also that they're doing an online census response, so that's going to be cool for people that don't bother with mailing something back. So the census is really trying, and it's really upon us to make sure that the word gets out, and that from media organizations to local groups, that everyone is hands-on in the effort to make sure that nobody is left out.
Carlos Figueroa and his colleagues from the New York Regional Census Center, who will be available to answer additional questions about the census and its operations. Will you please join me in thanking Cristian Farias?